Imagine a small, quiet town where everyone knows each other, suddenly gripped by a nightmare they never saw coming. 10 women, all brutally murdered, and the killer, hiding in plain sight for decades. It wasn't who anyone expected, and each murder was calculated, each scene hauntingly arranged. Over 5 years, a killer terrorized a town, and no one knew who he was until 30 years later when a massive DNA breakthrough happened. Stay tuned, because we're about to uncover the chilling story behind the Hwaseong murders. It's a seemingly ordinary day in Hwaseong, South Korea, in the fall of 1986. The town, a quiet farming community, never anticipated that it would become infamous as the setting for one of the most horrifying murder sprees in South Korea's history. Over the next 5 years, a series of grisly, calculated murders would claim the lives of 10 women and shake Hwaseong to its core. It began on September 15, 1986. A 70-year-old woman, returning from gathering vegetables, vanished without a trace. When her body was discovered days later in a field, police and townsfolk alike were horrified by the brutality of the murder. She had been strangled with her own clothing, a scarf twisted tightly around her neck. Police initially thought this might be a one-off crime, but it was only the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt Hwaseong. The killer struck again, and soon a chilling pattern emerged. Over the next several years, women of all ages, from their teens to their 70s, were assaulted and strangled. The scenes left behind were gruesome. The killer would bind the victims using their own clothing, often strangling them with stockings or underwear. Each crime scene was carefully staged, but with no fingerprints, no clues. Only the terrifying realization that the killer knew exactly what he was doing. The Hwaseong murderers' victims varied in age, but they shared one thing in common. They were all women, and they were all targeted in isolated locations. The killer was both methodical and cold, often using intimate items like stockings, bras, and other clothing to tie and gag the victims. Each act of violence was not only a killing, but an expression of control and brutality, suggesting a deeply disturbed, possibly psychopathic individual who harbored a violent disdain for women. By the third murder, word of the Hwaseong killer had spread. The community was gripped with terror. Parents no longer allowed their daughters to walk alone, and even older women who had once felt safe in their own town began to live in fear. The Hwaseong murders became a major national concern, stirring panic and mistrust across South Korea. Local and national media covered every detail, only amplifying the public's fear. Desperate to catch the murderer, the police launched one of the largest investigations in Korean history, interviewing over 21,000 individuals and investigating more than 2,000 suspects. But without advanced forensic tools, each interview, each piece of evidence, brought them no closer to identifying the killer. Detectives were working around the clock, but despite their exhaustive efforts, the killer seemed to be one step ahead, eluding capture at every turn. One suspect, Sung-yo, a man with an intellectual disability, was brought in and ultimately convicted of one of the murders. But many doubted his involvement. Allegations surfaced that his confession had been coerced, and his family and advocates fought to prove his innocence. The lack of clear evidence, coupled with the intense public and governmental pressure to solve the case, led to a miscarriage of justice, as a potentially innocent man was imprisoned while the real killer continued to roam free. The Hwaseong killer had a signature. In almost every case, he used the victim's own belongings to restrain, gag, and ultimately strangle them. For instance, in one murder, he used a pair of stockings to tie the victim's hands and gagged her with a scarf, her clothing items twisted and bound with a level of precision and intent. Each murder was an act of violence and terror, and each one seemed to be pushing the killer further, as if taunting the police with his ability to evade capture. In 1991, after 5 years and 10 brutal murders, The killings stopped just as suddenly as they had begun. With no new leads, no new murders, and no trace of the killer, the Hwaseong case went cold. Police and the community were left haunted by the unknown. Who was this murderer? Was he still out there, waiting to strike again? The case grew cold, but the community remained forever scarred. In 2019, over 30 years after the Hwaseong murders began, a breakthrough finally arrived. With advancements in DNA technology, evidence collected from the crime scenes was re-examined. DNA profiling, which had been unavailable in the 1980s, provided a match. Lee Chun-jae, a convict already serving a life sentence for unrelated murders and sexual assaults, was identified as the Hwaseong killer. The discovery shocked the country and offered long-awaited answers to families and a grieving community. During questioning, Lee Chun-jae confessed to the murders in chilling detail. He revealed his methods, explaining how he had planned each attack, choosing isolated women and carefully concealing his tracks. Lee described how he took pleasure in his killings, showing no remorse for the lives he destroyed. But there was a tragic irony. Despite his confession, he could not be prosecuted for the Hwaseong murders, as the statute of limitations had expired. Justice, in the end, would not be served in a courtroom. The Hwaseong murders left an indelible mark on South Korea. The case exposed serious flaws in the investigative process and highlighted the need for advanced forensic tools, changes that were soon implemented nationwide. The case also inspired a powerful societal shift, sparking conversations about police accountability, justice, and the rights of crime victims. Today, Hwaseong has healed in many ways, but for the families of the victims, the pain remains. This case reminds us that justice is not always guaranteed, even with time. The Hwaseong murders are more than just a series of tragic events. They are a dark chapter that exposed the vulnerabilities within society's promise of safety and justice. It serves as a sobering reminder that, even in the quietest places, unimaginable darkness can exist, and that sometimes answers come too late. Today, Hwaseong's landscape remains the same, but its people have changed. They continue forward, living in peace, yet haunted by the memory of a time when their town was a hunting ground for a relentless predator. The Hwaseong murders may now be solved in name, but the wounds they left behind have yet to heal. We have plenty more chilling stories lined up that will leave you questioning just how much of what you see is real. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and we'll see you in the next one. Don't forget to subscribe.